My name is Lauren Ashby, and I found out my father was gone for real. Not the hospital version of gone, the paperwork version of gone. When a bank teller named Doreen called my cell phone at 9:14 in the morning, 4 days after his death, and asked if I was calling to confirm the wire transfer on the Ashby life insurance disbursement. I said confused that I hadn't called anyone, that I hadn't even received the check yet, that we hadn't scheduled the funeral. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that tells you a stranger has just realized they've said something they weren't supposed to say. "I'm so sorry," Doreen said. "I must have the wrong sibling. Your brother came in yesterday and processed everything already." My father had been dead for 4 days. My brother had already cashed his life insurance check, and I found out because of a wrong number. Welcome back to True Family Drama, the channel for real stories of betrayal, justice, and the family members who thought grief would keep everyone else too distracted to notice. If this story sounds like something that's happened in your own family, I want you to stay with me, because it gets worse before it gets better, and it ends in a way I don't think my brother saw coming. If you're new here, subscribe, because this channel is full of stories exactly like this one. To explain how my brother managed to cash a $250,000 check 4 days after our father's death, before we'd even picked a date for the funeral, I need to back up and tell you who my father was and who my brother had become long before any of this happened. My father, Walter Ashby, was a retired postal supervisor from a suburb outside Columbus. The kind of man who balanced his checkbook by hand well into his 70s out of pure stubbornness, even after my sister-in-law tried to set him up with online banking twice. He married my mother in 1979, raised my brother Derek and me in the same three-bedroom colonial the whole time, and worked 34 years at the Postal Service without ever once, as far as I know, taking an unscheduled sick day. My mother died of a stroke when I was 24, and after that, my father lived alone for 11 years, fiercely independent, fiercely private about his finances in the specific way people of his generation often are. He didn't discuss money, not with me, not really with Derek either, though Derek would come to claim otherwise once there was money on the table worth claiming a relationship over. I should tell you about Derek honestly, the way I've had to learn to see him honestly, which took most of my adult life and, frankly, this exact situation to fully complete. Derek is 2 years older than me, and for most of our childhood he was the golden version of a son that fathers like mine are supposed to get. Captain of the baseball team, first in the family to go to college, the kind of charm that got him out of speeding tickets and into good graces with virtually every authority figure he ever met. What that charm covered for, though, and what I didn't fully understand until I was well into my 30s, was a pattern of financial recklessness that started in college with credit card debt our father quietly paid off twice. Just this once, Lauren, don't make a thing of it, and never really stopped. Two failed business ventures, a used car lot that folded within 2 years, a franchise sub shop that lasted 18 months, a bankruptcy filing in his early 40s that our father helped him navigate without ever mentioning it to me until I found the paperwork by accident, cleaning out a filing cabinet after Mom died. By the time our father passed, Derek was 51 years old, divorced, renting a condo he was 2 months behind on, and, I would later learn, quietly drowning in credit card debt he'd told absolutely no one about, including, apparently, his own children. Our father's death was sudden, which I think matters to how quickly everything after it unraveled. He'd had a mild heart condition for years, managed with medication, nothing that suggested urgency. He died in his sleep on a Sunday night in September, found by his neighbor Carol the next afternoon when he didn't come out to get his newspaper. The same quiet, undramatic kind of death that somehow makes the aftermath feel even more disorienting, because there's no hospital bedside vigil to slowly prepare you, no gradual decline to soften the blow. One day he was texting me a photo of tomatoes from his garden. 4 days later, A bank teller I'd never spoken to in my life was accidentally telling me my brother had already spent money that, by any reasonable timeline, none of us should have had access to yet. I want to walk you through the mechanics of how this was even possible, because I didn't fully understand it myself until I'd spent a week on the phone with the insurance company. And I think the specifics matter for anyone watching this who might find themselves in a similar position someday. My father's life insurance policy, a 30-year term policy through his old employer's retirement benefits that had converted into a permanent policy in his final working years, listed two primary beneficiaries, Derek and me, 50-50, a detail I only learned for certain after the fact, though I'd always assumed it, since our father was fastidiously fair about most things, in a way that made this entire situation feel even more like a betrayal of his character, not just his money. Life insurance payouts, unlike assets that pass through a will, don't go through probate. They go directly to the named beneficiaries once the company receives a certified death certificate and processes the claim, which can happen astonishingly fast if someone is motivated, has the paperwork ready, and doesn't wait for anyone else. Derek, it turned out, had been motivated. He had, according to what I eventually pieced together, requested a certified copy of the death certificate directly from the county on the same day our father was found, before I'd even flown back into town, before we'd chosen a funeral home, before the obituary had been written. He'd called the insurance company himself, initiated a claim under his own name only, and using what I can only describe as a technicality in how joint claims are sometimes processed when beneficiaries don't file simultaneously, received an initial partial disbursement into his own account within 72 hours, structured as an advance against his 50% share, with my half theoretically still pending until I filed my own portion of the paperwork. What Derek did next is the part that turned this from understandable grief-stricken urgency into something I can only call calculated. He took that partial disbursement, walked into our father's own bank branch, the one Doreen worked at, the one where our father had held accounts for over 20 years, and asked to open a discussion about handling the estate accounts efficiently since I'm the one local and available. A sentence that, on its face, sounds reasonable, and was, I'd learn, the exact sentence he used to get Doreen comfortable enough that when the insurance disbursement fully cleared 2 days later, she processed a same-day wire transfer of the entire remaining balance into an account with Derek's name on it, believing, because Derek had told her so directly, that this was the arrangement the family had already agreed to. We had agreed to nothing. I hadn't spoken to Derek about the insurance money at all in those 4 days. Our conversations had been entirely about funeral logistics, flower arrangements, whether our cousin Patty from Michigan could make it in time. Not once had Derek mentioned that he'd already filed a claim, let alone that he was actively moving money. I called him within the hour of hanging up with Doreen, my hands shaking so badly I had to sit down on my own kitchen floor to steady myself before dialing. He answered on the second ring, his voice doing the thing it always did when he sensed trouble coming before you'd even said why you called. Light, a little too warm, already halfway into damage control before the damage had even been named. I asked him directly whether he'd cashed Dad's life insurance check. There was a pause, shorter than Doreen's had been, but just as telling, and then he said, "Lauren, I was going to talk to you about this. I just, Things are really tight for me right now, and I figured since I was already handling the funeral arrangements locally, it made sense for me to get the ball rolling on my half so I'm not underwater covering the deposit for the funeral home." His half. He said his half like it was a settled fact, instead of an assumption he'd raced to make true before I could weigh in. I asked him, as calmly as I could manage sitting on my own kitchen floor, how much he'd actually received, because Doreen's phrasing, the wire transfer, singular, complete, had already told me this wasn't a partial advance he was describing. He was quiet again, and then he told me the number, and it wasn't half of anything. It was the entire $248,000, All of it, wired into an account with only his name on it, 4 days after our father's death, while I was still coordinating with a funeral home 3 states away from where I lived and trying to figure out how to get time off work to fly back for an event we hadn't even scheduled yet. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because I think grief and rage occupying the same body at the same time is one of the strangest, most disorienting experiences a person can have. I wasn't crying. I was almost eerily calm, the way I understand now people sometimes get when their nervous system simply cannot process two catastrophic things, a father's death and a brother's theft, in the same emotional register, so it picks one and shelves the other for later. I asked Derek, very evenly, how he intended to fix this. He told me, and I remember this sentence with perfect clarity because it's the sentence that changed how I saw my brother for the rest of my life. Lauren, don't make this a whole thing right now. Dad just died. Can we not do this while we're still grieving? Grief as a shield. My brother had used our father's death both as the opportunity to move quickly and, in the very same breath, as the reason I shouldn't be allowed to react to what he'd done with that opportunity. It was, I would come to realize over the following weeks, a version of exactly the same move he'd been running our entire lives, creating a crisis, then using the general chaos and emotional weight of the moment to make anyone questioning him feel like the real problem was their timing, not his behavior. I flew back to Ohio 2 days later, earlier than planned, specifically so I could deal with this in person rather than over increasingly tense phone calls. What I found when I got there made everything worse. Derek hadn't just moved the money into his account and sat on it, the way a person genuinely overwhelmed by funeral costs and momentarily panicked might do. In the 3 days between the wire transfer and my arrival, he had paid off $11,000 in credit card debt across 2 cards, put a $4,000 deposit down on a used truck to replace the one that had, I learned, been repossessed 6 months earlier, without him ever mentioning it to me, and transferred $15,000 to his ex-wife, ostensibly for back child support he owed, though the timing suggested to me it was less about doing right by his kids and more about clearing an obligation that had likely been threatening legal action. In 4 days, before our father was even in the ground, my brother had spent $30,000 of money that was, at absolute minimum, half mine, and had done so with the kind of speed that told me clearly this wasn't panic. This was a plan he'd had ready long before our father actually died, waiting only for the opportunity to execute it. I confronted him at Dad's house, the same house we'd grown up in, standing in the kitchen where our mother used to make Sunday dinners, which felt like its own kind of cruelty, having this conversation in that specific room. I laid out what I knew: Doreen's call, the timeline, the credit card payoffs I'd found by pulling public records on the truck purchase, and later, through the estate attorney I'd already retained by that point, a full accounting of where the money had gone. Derek's response moved through 3 distinct phases, the way I've since learned people who've been caught in something they know is indefensible tend to move. First, minimization. It's not that big a deal, it's still technically my half, I'm just accessing it early. Then, when I pointed out that he'd taken the entire amount, not half, and had refused for 3 days to acknowledge that discrepancy, he moved to anger, accusing me of always making everything a legal issue and never trusting family, a genuinely stunning reversal given that he was the one who'd wired himself $250,000 behind my back. And finally, when neither of those worked, he moved to the thing that I think, in retrospect, was always the real foundation underneath everything else. A kind of wounded entitlement, telling me, "You have a good job, Lauren. You don't need this money like I do. I have kids. I have real bills. You've never once had to actually struggle the way I have, and now Dad's gone and you want to fight me over money you don't even need." I want to sit with that sentence for a moment, because I think it's the one that clarified everything for me. My brother wasn't confused about whether what he'd done was wrong. He knew exactly what he'd done.
What he was actually arguing was that his need was greater than my right, and that the greater need should simply be allowed to override the agreement our father had made, in writing decades earlier, about how his estate was supposed to be divided. It wasn't an accident that he'd taken all of it instead of half. It was a bet that grief, distance, and the family's general instinct to avoid conflict during a funeral would make me either too overwhelmed or too guilt-tripped to actually fight back.
He'd bet wrong. I retained an estate attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Carla Whitfield Nunes. No relation to any of my previous stories. Just a genuinely excellent attorney I found through a referral from my own firm's general counsel within the week. Carla explained something to me that I hadn't fully understood about how life insurance disbursements interact with named beneficiaries when a shared claim is filed unevenly. Because the policy specifically named both Derek and me as 50-50 beneficiaries, Derek had no legal right to claim, receive, or spend more than his designated half, regardless of how the insurance company's processing had allowed the transfer to clear. The insurance company itself, once notified of the discrepancy, was potentially liable for having disbursed funds outside the terms of the policy without confirming both beneficiaries' claims were being handled proportionally, a detail that meant this wasn't purely a fight between Derek and me. It was also, suddenly, a problem for the insurance company's own compliance department, one they were extremely motivated to resolve quickly and quietly once Carla's letter landed on their desk. Carla sent a formal demand letter to both the insurance company and, separately, directly to Derek, outlining the discrepancy and requesting immediate return of my half, $124,000, along with documentation of where the remaining funds had gone, since a full accounting matters enormously if a case ever needs to escalate to a breach of fiduciary claim, which, Carla told me candidly, was very much on the table if Derek didn't cooperate. The insurance company, facing potential liability for the improper disbursement, moved with a speed I found almost darkly funny, given how many other institutions in my life had moved at a glacial pace over far smaller matters. Within 2 weeks, they'd frozen further disbursements on the policy, entirely pending resolution, and opened an internal review of how the claim had been processed without confirming coordination between both named beneficiaries. Derek, faced with an insurance company compliance review, a lawyer's letter, and the very real possibility that spending disputed funds before a claim was resolved could be characterized, in the most serious version of events, as conversion, essentially theft of funds he had no clear legal right to unilaterally control, finally engaged an attorney of his own. What followed was 3 months of negotiation that I won't pretend was comfortable or fast, involving accountings of every dollar he'd spent, a payment plan for the portion he couldn't return immediately in cash since he'd already spent it, and, at Carla's insistence, a formal written acknowledgement signed by Derek that the funds had been distributed in violation of the policy's stated beneficiary terms, a document that existed less because I needed it financially, and more because I needed it to exist, needed there to be, somewhere, an actual record that what happened had genuinely happened, the way I imagine Renee needed her sister's forged signature sitting next to a real one, undeniable, in black and white. The funeral, I should mention, happened during all of this, 3 weeks after our father's death, delayed not because of the money dispute directly, but because by the time Derek and I were speaking again enough to coordinate logistics, 3 weeks had simply passed. I gave the eulogy alone. Derek sat in the front pew, and I remember looking out at him mid-sentence, delivering a story about our father teaching us both to ride bikes in the same driveway, and feeling a strange, sick vertigo at the gap between the brother I was publicly eulogizing our father alongside, and the brother who had, at that exact moment, still not returned a cent of what he owed me. Our extended family, most of whom didn't yet know what had happened, complimented Derek afterward on holding it together so well for everyone, a sentence I had to leave the reception early to avoid responding to honestly. The full resolution came just under 4 months after our father died. Derek repaid the outstanding balance in a combination of a lump sum, money it turned out he'd been sitting on the whole time, in a savings account he'd claimed didn't exist during our first several conversations, and a structured payment plan for the remainder, monitored by both our attorneys, that concluded 8 months later. I want to be honest that I don't know, to this day, whether Derek ever genuinely understood what he did as wrong, or whether he simply understood that the consequences of not fixing it had become more expensive than the convenience of having taken it in the first place. Those are very different kinds of remorse, and I've made my peace with probably never knowing which one I actually got. What I did with my share, once it was finally, fully resolved, mattered to me in a way I didn't fully anticipate until I was standing in my father's garden the following spring, the same garden he used to text me tomato photos from, deciding what to do with it now that he was gone, and Derek had, by mutual agreement worked out through the estate, taken the house itself as his portion of the physical estate in exchange for a reduced claim on other remaining assets. The one part of this whole mess that actually resolved with something resembling fairness, since Derek genuinely did want to stay near where our parents had lived, and I, by that point, wanted nothing more to do with the property that had become the backdrop for the worst conversation of my adult life. I used a portion of my inheritance to set up a small trust for my niece and nephew, Derek's kids, structured so the money would go directly toward their college tuition years from now, administered by Carla's firm rather than by either Derek or me directly. I did this not for Derek's benefit, and not, if I'm honest, entirely selflessly either. I did it because those two kids didn't ask to have a father who mortgaged his own integrity in a moment of financial desperation, and I refused to let their college fund become collateral damage in a fight that was never actually about them. I think my father, who spent 34 years showing up for a job he could have coasted through and never once did, would have understood that decision better than almost anything else I did in those 8 months. Derek and I speak now, occasionally, mostly around holidays, in the careful, slightly formal way people speak when a relationship has been fundamentally renegotiated rather than repaired. He's never once brought up the insurance money unprompted since the payment plan concluded. I've never once let myself forget it either. I don't think those two facts are in conflict. I think they're just what's actually true about where we landed. Not reconciliation exactly, but a kind of peace that doesn't require either of us to pretend the last 4 months of our father's life didn't reveal something real about who we both are when money and grief collide at the same time. I still think about Doreen sometimes, the way I think Renee still thinks about Walt at the UPS store. A stranger doing an ordinary job who, through nothing more than an honest mistake, handed me the one piece of information that let me protect myself before it was too late to protect anything at all. She called to apologize, eventually, mortified, worried she'd get in trouble for the wrong number call that had exposed the whole thing. I told her the truth, which is that her mistake was the only reason I found out in time to do anything about it at all, and that I would never, not once, hold that against her. If anything, I've come to think of that wrong number as the one piece of grace in an otherwise brutal 4 months. Proof that sometimes the truth finds you sideways, through an accident, because the people who were supposed to tell you directly had already decided you didn't need to know. That's my story. My brother cashed our father's entire life insurance payout 4 days after his death, before we'd even scheduled the funeral, and spent $30,000 of it before I ever found out. And I only found out because a bank teller dialed the wrong sibling. If you've ever had someone in your family, treat your grief as a window of opportunity instead of a shared loss. I want you to hear this clearly. Your right to what's yours doesn't pause just because someone else is in a hurry to take it. Ask for the accounting. Read the policy. Get the letter in writing. And never let anyone tell you that protecting yourself during a loss is somehow a betrayal of the person you actually lost. If this story hit home, subscribe to True Family Drama. Tell me in the comments if you've ever gotten a piece of the truth by accident, the way I did, and I'll see you in the next one.